Welcome, everyone. This is the second SRN conversation to be recorded. Start the way that our former Executive Council President, Carmen Sophia Brenes, started hers, discussing what drew her to the SRN. So what drew me to the SRN was that it was international, it combined academics and practitioners, and its mission was to bring more focus to the art and craft of screenwriting, which to me is the foundation of filmmaking, whether that film is seen on an IMAX theater or a tiny phone. For me, films are repositories of stories, and this collection of SRN Conversations is meant to be a repository, an archive of the history of the Screenwriting Research Network. It's a lovely, congenial group that came together to make connections and further the study of screenwriting. For me, the very first conversation was opened by Carmen's story. So this is mine. I was working with Jules Selbo. I had been a television writer with her and had gone into academia with her. And she had attended the Brussels conference. She came to me and said, Roseanne, you have got to go to this conference. It's wonderful. The very next year was Australia. But I had been to a couple of local conferences in Los Angeles, and I was very nonplussed. I didn't really meet anybody. They weren't very exciting. And I just thought flying all the way to Australia for that same kind of experience was not going to be valuable to me. I am so sorry that I made that choice. The very next year, of course, the conference happened in Madison. And it was in the States, and Jewel wouldn't let me stay home. So I went to Madison, and there I met Rose Farrell and Paula Russo and Margaret McVeigh and Ralph, all these people that I'm now on the executive council with. So it turned out to be one of the most wonderful conferences I'd ever gone to. And from it came articles and chapters and books and swapping visits between myself and Oxford and bringing people from Oxford to me. And since then, of course, I've been to London and Leeds and Dunedin and Milan and Porto. And these have basically become the family vacations for my 24-year-old son and my husband and I. And because of that, they're memories that I'll never lose. And my son has grown up going around the world as a normal thing. So I have lots to thank the SRN for. And right now, I really regret not having gone to Australia. So I'm happy to hear that today in this conversation, I'm going to get to hear and help catalog how wonderful that conference was with both Kathryn Millard and Alex Munt. And also we'll be hearing about Madison, where I was with JJ McDonald. Farrell for coming up with this idea. She's our membership officer, and she thought we should save this history. And I really think that her work shepherding it and bringing us all together has been something beautiful. So I want to thank Rose. And then I want to get started talking about all these great events. So my first question is going to be how you all came up with the themes for the conferences you decided to host, and how you think those themes were suited by the keynote speakers you chose and the kind of presentations that happened. So who would like to start?
I'm happy to start. And Alex might like to pick up on that as well. So Alex Munt and I co-convened, hosted the conference in Australia that we're really sorry that you didn't come to, because it was fantastic. Well, we think it was fantastic, and we certainly had very good responses. I guess programming is always contextual, isn't it? So we had been involved in the conference in the Screenwriting Research Network since the beginning. In fact, I think that's where I first met JJ at the first event in London, which brought together a smaller group of people. But I think that there was a sense that a whole lot of things were happening around the world. There were quite a lot of us who were practitioners, academics in universities around the world that were all doing our own thing in our various countries and had been for a while. And so the Screenwriting Research Network and Jill Neam's initiative of the journal kind of happened at the same time, but there was also quite a lot of publications coming out. I know that I first read JJ's book about independent cinema and screenwriting, was very excited to read that because it's the kind of stuff that Alex and I were working on and talking a lot about in Australia, as were our colleagues. There was the journal, there was Steve Moras's book. There was a whole bunch of things going. So I think screenwriting research had been happening in our various countries for a long time, but it was much more we hadn't kind of connected internationally. So after I went to and spoke at the first one, Alex and I became, I think that we were both regular attendees of the conferences in Europe, which were really exciting, that we got to meet a whole lot of people with similar kinds of questions about what the screenplay is and might be, how it was shifting, changing. And this kind of, as you were saying, Roseanne, this incredible community of people who were very collaboratively minded and very welcoming and generous. You didn't have to leave half of your identity and interest behind at the door when you came along. You didn't have to be this kind of industry person or this theorist or this practitioner. It was all together. So I think it was contextual for us. And the thing that Alex and I talked a lot about, in fact, I can remember us having discussions about it at the other conferences when we put our pitch for people to come all the way to Australia and kind of embrace not only Europe, but also the Pacific Rim, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. And also Australian and New Zealanders are incredibly hardy travellers. We felt we had been making the trek a long time, and we were really glad when people agreed to come our way. So we wanted to put
a big
creative practice.
I was going to say yes. A big part of that, I think, was revenge. There were so many conferences which we would get off the plane after 30-hour flights, and it was always September, and so in Australia the teaching time is kind of difficult around. Literally plan your flight potentially to arrive that morning or the day before, and so it was good to see a lot of world-weary European travellers at our conference after many years of Kathryn and I travelling. But I think that point Kathryn made about geography is also an important one, because I know that the Screenwriting Research Network was very keen on thinking about not only Australia and New Zealand, which has always had strong representation from the past, but also thinking about the Asia Pacific. Whether the SRN got there is probably a bit of a difficult ambition, and I think for the future of the SRN, it's probably still a really interesting question. Given the fact, particularly pedagogically, the international students and so on, we teach screenwriting through. It's a really interesting kind of question. But I also think if you look at some of the other moving image cultures, for example, artists moving image and so on, they've really embraced the Pacific and the Asia Pacific as part of that conversation. I think screenwriting could probably still do a little bit better then, but the conference in Australia, I think, was a really interesting step towards that. And that geography of our conference and of that 2012 conference, I think, was really put people in a bit of a different mindset to think about screenwriting and to think about screenwriting. So it's just being here, just being down under, just being in this part of the world, I think was quite an interesting stimulus for those conference conversations.
JJ.
I think the point about being good travelers, I think that's true of people in Australia and New Zealand. One of the things I was surprised at were the number of people, I have a note, surprised by the number of people who came from Australia or New Zealand to our conference, which was the first to be held in the US. So that was interesting. I had to look at what the title of ours was called. It was Screenwriting in a Global and Digital World. And I think that was just to create a broad enough scope for various papers. I thought, well, that would cover a lot of territory. I should say that Kelly Conway's participation was really critical in my putting the department for about 4 years, including during the pandemic. I think she's had enough of things for a while, so she just stepped down, and I think she stepped out. So, but I went to Kelly, and she had organized an Anya's Florida conference that was very successful previously. And so as a colleague, I just asked her, well, I was thinking about doing it. It was like, well, what's involved? Is this really doable? And I told her what we were doing, and she really liked the idea of it. And she said, it's so great. I think we should do this, and I'm willing to help you. And I have to say that she did help 50%. She worked as hard as I did. So that needs to be pointed out. A lot of my memories of the conference involve logistics. One of the things that was difficult for us was that I never knew this before joining the SRN, but that the month of August is somehow sacred to people in Europe. And so we wanted to have the conference in September, but the problem was at UW-Madison, football is in the fall, and 80,000 people converge on the city, and the city isn't that big. It's about 240,000 people. So there's no hotels, there's no restaurants, there's not anything available during football. And the football team the athletic department wouldn't tell us when the football season actually started. And the other thing was that we had to decide was, so the date was August 20th to 22nd. So that created a lot of problems for people who were outraged that their vacations were being interrupted by an academic conference, which I don't have those kind of feelings about vacation, but apparently some people do. And also, there were a lot of financial problems, and we applied for a grant that for some reason were turned down. And so then we really had to figure out how are we going to do this without any money. We knew that we could get money from the registration, but we didn't have any money to deal with. And so one of the things that we were looking for was, to have it at a conference center on campus, but they were very expensive. And so then we decided to do it in-house, which is what pushed it into August and away from football, but also because school was going to start, and then our own department, the rooms wouldn't be available and whatnot. So there were a lot of logistical problems. But anyway, we managed to pull it off somehow. I don't know how.
It's a good thing to hear, because I've done the same thing. I'm hosting the 2023 in Missouri, and I had to find a weekend when football was not happening in this little town in Missouri, which I did find, thankfully, because I couldn't believe football ruled the world. But apparently it does.
No, it does. Yeah.
Great. So JJ gave us his theme, and then I didn't get from Kathryn or Alex what you guys chose as the theme that sort of held up together what the presentations would be about.
We called it words and images, but as I think we've both said, our interest was putting a very strong emphasis on creative practice, because that seemed a kind of theme that had brought many of us together, and that perhaps we wanted to highlight in the conference in Sydney. So, for example, that's reflected in our keynotes, who were critic, film essayist, theorist Adrian Martin, who had done a lot of work on screenwriting over the years, and talked about, the focus of his keynote was genetic criticism, and this idea that there was a genetic structure that could be, that questions early in the process could be traced all through the kind of scripting and production. So in a way, he was making an argument for the really central role of screenwriters in shaping not just the script, but the whole kind of creative process. We also had JJ, of course, who again was one of those hardy travelers who came from the States to Australia and did a fantastic keynote about the aesthetics of independent cinema in a very detailed, insightful way. We had some Helen Grace, a kind of independent filmmaker and theorist, picked up on some of the work in the Screenwriting Research Network and talked about the history of the typewriter and cinema and riffed on that. But we also had Ian David, a very well-regarded screenwriter in Australia, television screenwriter, a really powerful drama, award-winning drama, who was at Sydney University and came and talked about kind of emotion and the screenplay as a writer. And one of our closing discussions was with Keith Thompson, one of the writers of The Sapphires, a feature film that was currently in cinemas. And we had an in conversation where he talked us through that. But I'm sure Alex will want to pick up on this. We picked up on this theme of creative process, alternative histories, alternative futures, etc., right through the conference.
Yeah, I think it just reminds me, I think JJ's presentation was about indie film and place, I think, from memory, JJ. And I think that some of the themes which the Sydney conference set up, I think you can really see have been consolidated within the research of the network. And some of those things that Kathryn and I, in our own work and are particularly interested in, I think have filtered through quite nicely in terms of publications, research, collaborations, and so on. Some of the things I looked at the program and the way words and images is a very broad theme. But when you think about what it really means to write images, it's a deep and complex question. And you can think about, yes, screenwriting is writing moving images from the screen, but it's within a tradition of other ways of writing pictures and thinking about pictures, thinking about pictorialism and so on. So some of the things which we were interested in at that time particularly were things about how screenwriting interacts with things like the graphic novel, interacts things with comics, illustration, Kathryn mentioned the graphic essay, and really the visual arts in general. So I think if you like to sort of tug screenwriting a little bit and the way that the network thinks about screenwriting into a bit of a wider tradition of visual arts culture, I think is something that I hope that conference gave people a bit of a broader lens to kind of think about, and then tying into, as I said, it mentioned JJ and place, and those ideas about place, I think, are also, if you flip back through, for example, journal screenwriting, I see that place is a really interesting part of the research which people do within the network, and particularly perhaps in the less industrial modes and approaches to screenwriting as well. Yeah, so I think there was a real sort of strong theme, a broad theme, but a strong theme in that conference. And as Kathryn said, Adrian Martin's presentation on the cinematic idea is really starting from, I guess, the way about creative process and practitioners, how films come to fruition through those different stages. Which way is the cinematic idea or the screen idea or the different ways we represent that really come to fruition, and looking at the documents at hand as well. So I think that, there's some really interesting, looking back on it, looking back in 10 years now, I think there is the DNA of the conference, if you like, which is interesting to see some of those seminal ideas and the way that they be picked up by other people in the network and taken forward as well.
I love that idea. And also anyone talking about comics 10 years ago before the Avengers happened, and look how they took over the world of scripts. That's hilarious. Well, that's wonderful. Wonderful. JJ, can you tell us about some of your keynote speakers as well?
Yeah, so we had 4 keynote speakers. We originally planned to have 3, as I'll explain. So Larry Gross, I had met Larry Gross, who is a screenwriter on 48 Hours, and was, really, I thought of as an industry screenwriter, although very interested in independent film. And I met him at a conference where I was showing a film, and he came up to me and he said, I know your film. And he knew a very well-known avant-garde film that I did, but he had a PhD from NYU, but he was in fact working in the industry. So thought he would have a very interesting perspective. And he had this theory of Watergate. I don't know, I think you were all there at the conference, right? And it was really basically about, what does each character know? and how much information does each character know? And if I remember, Ikira was the film that he used as his example. In terms of the idea of place, I had written an article about Kelly Reichert and John Raymond's collaboration. And so I had contacted Kelly Reichert, and she said to me, "Oh, I'm so busy. Why don't you just talk to John? He has nothing to do." and so I contacted John and said, "I hear you have nothing to do." And so, so anyway, he became a major informant in my article about their collaboration. And I don't know if you remember, but he showed this really hilarious cable video that he made called Croc. It was absolutely hilarious. It was just awful. It was his attempt as a filmmaker. And of course, he's a terrific writer. And he talked about the politics of regionalist art making in general. And so regional film was something, that's, he's a regional writer. Most of the settings for their collaborations come from him and his place in the Pacific Northwest. And I know Kelly has tried to scout locations elsewhere, but she winds up making them where he actually had them set originally. And interestingly, I just wrote an article for a book chapter for a book on American indie cinema on First Cow, and it was about their collaboration again, which was based on his novel Half-Life, The Half-Life. And so, which is very unusual for her to adapt from a novel, which I was very interested in, since she prefers short stories to such things as novels. We also had Kristen Thompson gave a keynote. David had given one, I believe, in Brussels. And so Kristen gave a talk about, she wrote a book about 4-act structure in film and television, which people usually say 3-act structure, but she argued that it was actually for Hollywood films 4 acts. And I think it's 3 acts there are mostly independent films are often 3 acts because they're shorter than Hollywood films typically. Anyway, it was about how the 4-act structure became extended when people put out Blu-rays or DVDs and add to that. So, and the last person to give was Jill Nelms. We invited to do a keynote, and my cat wants to talk. He's 18. He has a lot to say. He's lived a long life. Anyway, I had contacted Jill, and I found out that she wasn't coming to the conference. I said, "Really?" And I think she had just left a position at a university, and she said, "Oh yeah, it's just too much for me." And so it's like, well, I think that JOS should be represented at the conference in some sort of way. And so, I arranged for her to do a combination keynote and workshop. And so she did a historical overview of screenwriting research in all media, especially television. And then she also did a workshop on initiatives, on publishing initiatives such as JOS, the Paul Graves screenwriting series, and also Jules Selbo's. She was doing the International Women Filmmakers. And so those were among the topics that I remember Jill talked about. So it was really nice that, we could figure out some way to bring Jill to the conference. And it was great. So that's who ours was.
That's great. And I think your cat is trying to explain to us why Cats as a film did not work.
I don't know what he's trying to explain.
That's wonderful. One of the other things we thought about talking about was, what are the memories you have of connections and products, in terms of people's collaborations that came out of meeting at your conference, whether that's your own memory of something you put together after a conference, or people that said, oh, because I met this person, we've now done this journal article or this piece together. So let's talk a little bit about the collaborations we know came from traveling to conferences.
For me, I think a lot of them were around publication. I think that the SRN and the conferences kind of stimulated a lot of publication. It's difficult for me to say. I mean, obviously there were special editions of journals. And in our case, I think I was finishing my screenwriting book and was under enormous pressure, to put it mildly, for Powergraph, and Alex kindly took on editing the special edition, which had our keynotes and some other invited pieces in the call for papers. But I guess my impression more of any one conference, but of them overall, one of the things that the conferences really stimulated was more opportunities to collaborate around publications, whether they were edited collections or special editions of journals, or indeed, projects that happened through the Powergrave kind of screenplay series and so on. So for me, a lot of the collaboration that opened up, and I understand that to be the case for lots of the other people who participated in our conference and other conferences, was these opportunities to publish, which is inevitably collaborative, whether it's an edited collection or an individual piece. You're always, you're writing for a community in a sense, and other people are part always of kind of refereeing and testing out ideas and so on. So I think that that's something that's been a real strength of these conferences.
Right. I have to say that I think it was through the SRN that your name originally came up. I don't know, but I know I discovered an article that I had discovered an article that Kathryn had written. I found it online, and I had finished Me and You and Memento and Fargo, I read Kathryn's article, and I just felt like, well, nobody's really like interested in this, and it was just like, wow, like here's this other person. I wrote her this crazy email about well, I'm doing the same. We're interested in the same things, and then of course the idea of going to the SRN at the time. I mean, it was an idea really. So there were maybe 8 people involved in the organization, and so when Ian asked me, would you like to give a keynote at this, I thought, wow, this is incredible. It's incredibly risky. I mean, what if I travel all the way to Leeds? No one shows up, and I feel like an absolute idiot as a result. But he said, the one thing that he said to me that convinced me, he said, oh, and Kathryn Millard would like you to come to Leeds. I said, oh, wow. So anyway, and I still was skeptical, but it turned out to be a major event in my life to have gone to that conference. And I would say, I have a note here that all my writing since that book stems from my association with the SRN. So the books on Warhol, indie cinema, most recently on the Florida Project, all the ideas were developed from basically the connections and the ideas that really were floating around the SRN. And so, it's really, I found it just amazingly influential on my own career. And in terms of our conference, I remember that Roseanne, you weren't in Brussels, but in Brussels, Spencer Parsons and Lenny Lengebeck did a presentation about how they collaborated on a screenplay without knowing each other. It was like going on a blind date. And so it was hilarious. And then we rode the plane back together and we talked, I think we talked for 8 hours straight on the way back, or 6 hours or 7 hours. Well, it was to the Midwest. So it was, probably 8 hours. And we just talked nonstop. He was across the aisle. We were just like, talking to each other. And he gave a paper in Madison. I remember they gave a paper, and it was on Cassavetes' use of improvisation and this idea of the spacious screenplay, which is, I was writing a lot about minimal screenplays, but they were writing about overwritten screenplays with Cassavetes, that he overwrote the screenplays. And, that turned out to be influential when I wrote the book, Rewriting Indie Cinema. I mean, and I contacted Spencer and they didn't have footnotes. They never, they had footnotes, but they lost them or so. Anyway, it was very important. It was very important, the research, and, certainly, just the work of, Kathryn and Ian and Alex and, all these people, Stephen Morris, it's just so many people have influenced me enormously. And so, as I said, it's sort of the defining moment in terms of my, how that my research, it set my research agenda for, 3 more books and numerous articles and whatnot.
Wow. Alex, what are you thinking about? What collaborations you're thinking about?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, Roseanne. I think two things. One thing is about these conferences and in general a little bit is the way that the conversation changes quite quickly around screenwriting research, and 2 ways which has changed quickly, which we would all know from our lived experience to a degree and research, is that one is around immersive media forms. I'm working with Kath Dooley for the Paragraph series on something around writing for spatiality at the moment. But the other thing, which is obviously streaming here as well. So that really big transitions of happening. And it's those sort of collaborations which the SRN Conferences has set up, which you can see moving forth into very different areas on the program. I doubt that in Sydney or perhaps in Madison, Wisconsin as well, that those, for example, those 2 things featured at all potentially, or featured very little. But today the screenscape is quite radically configured. But I think the collaborations from the earlier days of the Screenwriting Network will push forward into those new frontiers as well. And the other one I was thinking about from an Australian context is that, yes, conferences are set up to be international and we love to visit these places, but strangely enough, it also puts you closer in contact with your own colleagues from around the block once you're sort of forced to meet. And I can think about Australians are very well represented and always have been at the network. And I'm thinking about, obviously, Craig Batty's highly involved, Margot Nash, who gave a presentation on women in screenwriting at that conference, Margaret McVeigh, Rose Farrell, Hester Joyce, Simon Weaving, Kath Dooley, and so on. And I know that I think what Kathryn knows about it is one of Steve Moras's projects is to look at this Australian contribution to screenwriting culture and research. So I think that's also been something quite local, which has emerged from what is like an international setting as well. And I think that's also perhaps what these conferences also do, is actually work in both ways, work globally, but also work locally to foster collaborations or to motivate those collaborations, even though, as I said, they might be kind of next door or down the corridor, which is quite interesting.
Well, I love that point. And, it's true, both meeting people from locally or attending with people, traveling with people who are from your locality to a far off distance. But likewise, it was in Milan that I met someone who teaches at a college down the street from me. And we had no idea that either existed. And here we were meeting in Milan to talk about. And now she comes and speaks to my MFA class. So it's that local and worldwide that is so special. That's wonderful. Well, I know that we want to be able to end sort of fairly in 45 minutes, which is about 5 minutes from now. So I'm wondering if you guys have any last thoughts about the experience of hosting and what you would, any advice you would leave, hello, for someone who's hosting in a couple of years, but also any memories you want to have recorded about the specialness of the SRN.
I feel like I'll jump in here. I feel like we've covered that to some degree. It's a really good question around the special officer, this notion of collaboration with colleagues and like-minded people and creating a sense of community, a very inclusive community that have supported each other's work internationally and locally. Because I think one of the issues around meeting up with people locally, as to pick up on what Alex was saying, is that often we're so insanely busy in our institutions and no one actually has got time to talk to people at the next institution. We actually have to go to this designated space of the conference, even if it's overseas, to get to do that. Sometimes people couldn't believe, for example, that I know I had never met Stephen Morass when the conference has started, and yet, you know, his book had just come out and we were all interested in similar things. I think I met him somewhere in Europe or Leeds or wherever, I don't know. So I think for me, a lot of the specialness is about that, the way that we impacted each other's work. In terms of memories of the conference, incredibly enjoyable. When you're organizing one, logistics. I think we all got the tone of that from what JJ said. And likewise, I have similar memories of JJ about the beginning. I had read his book, written to him incredibly enthusiastically, and was wildly excited that he was also going to participate. And so I think people have always built things from pretty slender beginnings, really. And as Alex has said, that just keeps happening. Things quickly pick up as a group of people committed to looking at new developments in our fields that you can test out ideas with, and the conversation changes quickly, which is fantastic.
Right. One thing that I wanted to say, and really spins off from what Kathryn was just talking about. I mean, I went to UFVA, University Film and Video Association, and SCMS. I've gone to many of those kinds of conferences, and I always meet people. I certainly know people, and Wisconsin has a lot of alum and whatnot, but I've never felt that I connected with other scholars in those other kinds of conferences. I mean, in the same way that I connected with a group of people, with this group of people at the SRN. So that's what seems really special to me. I think there's another conference I've got. Well, anyway, I mean, certainly, as I said, I know people, I've met people, I stay in touch with people, but I've never really been influenced and collaborated with and did projects with and whatnot, as I have with the SRN. So, and, in a way I felt pretty isolated because, I began as a filmmaker, and this switch to being a scholar was really quite different. And at a major research university, I think everybody was completely baffled, like, oh, like I just announced, I'm writing a book, of course, and they were like, what? So anyway, it's that was sort of interesting. So I always felt, I felt that they didn't quite understand exactly what I was doing, in the same way that I mentioned the other night that my colleagues probably didn't know that I was in the art department doing crits on painting and sitting in people's graduate student studios. And I thought, I wonder what my colleagues would think if they knew that this is what I did, you know, I mean, I did it a lot, a fair amount. And today I actually visited an artist. I just wrote a catalog about her. She makes abstract paintings, and she asked me to write a museum catalog. And so I was in her studio, and it reminded me of like that. Oh yeah, I used to do this a lot. So
Yeah, I was gonna say,
go for it.
yeah, no, that just reminded me, JJ, of perhaps Brussels, and I think we were walking through an exhibition together. It was maybe a Marguerite or one of the exhibitions. I think Kathryn, I think we were all there, and I just thought about that.
it was
Yeah, we were all there. I think, yeah, and I thought that's you know, some of the, you know, the very fond and favourable times were off the conference, of course, off the conference track, but we were still always talking about ideas and artworks, and you know,
Right.
and sort of, so the conversation may have been less, if you like, screenwriting focused, but it was still, you know, what interests us as people more broadly. And I think really look fondly back at some of those, just traipsing around foreign cities and going to art galleries and still having that sort of conversation, which just sort of, I just thought of, yeah, and that's a really happy memory.
That's so wonderful. Yes, I must say, just sitting around tables at lunch and saying, Craig, why hasn't there never been a special issue focused on women in screenwriting? And having Craig say, why don't you do it? Has been a marvelous kind of experience. And I can see that traveling through the history of the SRN. Well, we want to thank you guys all for being with us today. We think this is a lovely way to catalog the work that's been done and look at the history. And thank you all for being there at the beginning, because you've made what we're now enjoying possible. And we hope that you will continue to be involved to your personal choice of travel. If you want to come to America in 2023, I'll be there. But in the meantime, hopefully we'll see some of you in Vienna. And again, we thank you so much for your time, and we thank Rose for putting this together. Thanks, everybody.
yes, thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Good to see you. Bye-bye.
Good to
See
see
you.
you. Bye.